Today we're going to be discussing the Lindbergh baby case, and it's kind of a case that has a lot of information, so it may be a little bit of a longer podcast today. And a lot of the information is going to get confusing, but I'm going to try to keep it as clear as possible. So let's get into it. Now, we refer to the Lindbergh baby. We're referring to Charles Augustus Lindbergh Jr., who was the 20-month-old son of the esteemed American pilot Charles Lindbergh. Now, Charles Jr. was kidnapped around 9 p.m. on March the 1st, 1932, from his second-floor nursery in Hopewell, New Jersey, on the Lindbergh estate there. And his disappearance was originally discovered by Betty Gow, I'm not sure, who discovered his absence and reported it to the Lindberghs, who then obviously, reported it to the police. The first piece of evidence that was found was actually a ransom note that was found on the windowsill of the nursery. And the ransom note demanded $50,000, which is a lot in today's times, and I can imagine it would have been even more than that back in the day. Now let's talk a little bit about the evidence that was found there. One thing that they found was mud, possibly footprints in the nursery, and there were footprints under the nursery window that they couldn't make out. They couldn't make out what size, what, type shoe, anything like that, but there were footprints. They were distinctly, footprints, but you couldn't distinguish anything else about them. There was no blood, there were no fingerprints anywhere at the crime scene, but there was a broken ladder. And now remember this ladder because it's going to come into effect later. I'm going to explain to you what the significance of said ladder is. And from there, they started their investigation, obviously. They looked all around for the child. He couldn't be found, so they began by calling in the state police, and eventually the FBI even got involved. So the second ransom note, there are 13 ransom notes, by the way, which I had no idea until I started researching. But anyway, the second ransom note was received March the 6th, 1932, and it was postmarked from Brooklyn, and the note itself demanded an extra $20,000 added to the already $50,000 ransom demand. And the third ransom note was received 2 days later on March the 8th. The fourth was received March the 9th, and in the fourth, it was decided that Dr. John F. Condon would take the money to the drop, and that they would continue to contact one another through ads in the newspaper. Now, on March the 12th, the fifth ransom note was received by Condon, and it led to a sixth ransom note, which contained instructions for the drop. Now let's talk about the drop. Condon was to meet a man codenamed John at Woodlawn Cemetery. When he got to the meeting, this John character agreed to provide proof of identity of the child. Now after this, Condon took to the ads again to attempt contact. And on March the 16th, the baby's sleeping suit and a seventh ransom note were delivered to Condon. They later took the suit to Charles Lindbergh. He identified it as Charles Jr.'s suit. And so that was the proof of identity that Condon had requested. On March the 21st, an eighth ransom note was received indicating that the kidnapping had been planned for a year and that the family and anyone involved should cooperate with the demands because this wasn't just, spur of the moment thing. This was something that had careful planning and was done by experts. So let's fast forward to 9 days later on March the 30th, and the 9th ransom note was received. And in this note, the kidnapper threatened to up the ransom amount to $100,000. I think it's kind of unknown why he or she threatened to do that, but the threat was made. But on April the 1st, the 10th note was received instructing Condon to have the $70,000 ready by the following night. On April the 2nd, the next day, the 11th note was sent leading to the 12th, and it contained instructions for the actual drop. So all of this was like pre-drop instructions, which to me just seems very strenuous and very unnecessary. I feel like the more time they spend with the child, the more, demands they make, that then they're more likely to be caught. But that's just my opinion. Now, Condon convinced them to reduce the ransom to $50,000, which was accepted. And he handed the $50,000 to John that he had met before. Now, John, in return, handed him a receipt and a 13th ransom note. The 13th note said that the baby would be found in a boat named Nellie near Martha's Vineyard. Unfortunately, when the police and the FBI and the state police, everybody that, was working on the case, unfortunately, when they got there, the baby wasn't found. So that was an entire process just for the quote-unquote drop. And then it led to nothing. The baby wasn't found. Now let's fast forward to May the 12th, 1932. So about 2.5 months after the baby went missing originally. And this is when the case goes from a kidnapping to a murder. The baby's body is accidentally found about 4.5 miles southeast of the Lindbergh estate. It's about 45 feet from the highway in Mount Rose, New Jersey. Charles Jr. is partially buried and decomposing. His head has been crushed and there's a hole in his skull. Now, unfortunately, the entire body wasn't found. There were pieces missing. But there was enough to determine that cause of death was a blow to the head. And the coroner believed that time of death was about 2 months beforehand. So it's likely that Charles Jr. was killed the night of or soon after he was taken. So all of this leads us to our investigation. And the state police and the FBI are handling the investigation. Now, May the 3rd of 1932, they send out a notice to banks and stores and whatnot, telling them to look out for the ransom money. On May the 26th, $25,000 is offered as a reward for information. And that was, I believe, the FBI offered that. And unfortunately, there just wasn't a lot of progress. Some of the ransom money was eventually found later, I think that year actually, but it couldn't be traced. It kind of fell through. It was a lead that they thought was going to be really hot, and it actually just kind of fizzled out. But now let's get back to that ladder. The ladder was something that you think about, and it's just like, oh, it's a ladder. It's whatever. There are billions of ladders in the world. Not like this one. This ladder was handmade, and the police believed that someone familiar with woodworking made it. It was kind of crude. It wasn't, well put together, but it was clearly done by someone that knew how to work wood. And so that kind of led them down that avenue. Now, another thing that happened in late March of 1932, Betty Gow found Charles Jr.'s thumb guard on the estate. So, I'll explain to you why I think that's relevant in a moment, when we get to the suspects, which is what we're about to dive into now. The first suspect that we're going to discuss is Bruno Richard Hauptmann. Now, the way that he became a suspect is through some of the ransom money. It was determined that he had spent some. They traced the vehicle and found out, that it was this guy, and he had some of the ransom money with him. And if you look at this guy's picture, he looks really similar to the John character that Condon had described and made a composite of for the police. He was also a carpenter, which is a big deal because, again, the ladder was obviously made by someone who knew how to work wood. And his handwriting, they found a sample of that and compared it to the ransom note, and it was very similar. They also looked closely at the ladder and found that a lot of the tool marks on the ladder matched tools that Hauptmann had. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean anything, because again, if he's a woodworker, he's gonna have woodworking tools, just like every other woodworker is gonna have woodworking tools. So that, to me, wasn't as big a clue as I think it was to the police. But it could mean something, it could mean nothing. Evidence without context is not evidence. Anyway. And Hauptmann was eventually convicted for the crime and sentenced to death. So that's kind of where his story is in relation to this crime. He was convicted of it. People believed he did it. They believed there was enough circumstantial evidence. He was convicted and he was sentenced to death for it. But now, let me refer you to someone else who I believe is a suspect. And that is Charles Lindbergh Sr. And before, you gasp and freak out, I have reasons. Charles Lindbergh Sr. was known to be into eugenics. And it's believed that Charles Jr. had ailments. It's believed that he had, I don't remember what type of, genetic malformation of some type, but it's believed that he did have those. And so, maybe Charles Sr. didn't see him as perfect. And he could have, quote unquote, taken care of the problem. Charles Sr. was also associated with the Nazis, which were really big into eugenics, as I'm sure you guys know. And he wasn't really looked at because at the time he was America's hero. He was this, handsome, young, brave pilot who nobody wanted to look askance at, and that's really sad. And obviously he had access to the baby. I mean, it was his child. He lived in the same home. And he certainly, being America's hero, had access and connections to people that could make his problem disappear, so to speak. So, to me, the thumb guard that was found on his property leads me to think that Charles Jr. was there longer than is claimed in the reports. My theory, just kind of to wrap this whole thing up, is that Charles Lindbergh Sr. did it. Maybe he had help, maybe he had Haltman's help, or maybe, he did it himself. Either way, I think that this case is so sketchy and so full of just ridiculous amounts of publicity and misinformation that I can't really picture anyone else doing it. I don't get why there were 13 ransom notes. I don't get why people weren't suspicious that the baby was only found less than 5 miles from his home. I don't get why, the family wasn't looked at more. But again, this was back in the 1930s, and he came from a family that had a lot of power and had a lot of influence, unfortunately. And that's led to us not knowing what happened to this baby. Today we're going to be discussing the Lindbergh